Today's session is Practical Climate Risk Management by Laura Lengnick. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I kind of feel like we're kind of at the part of the day when things really start. Is that coming over the speakers? Okay. At any rate, we're at the part of the day in a conference. I've been doing this conference going lots and lots of years. But I've never had bells come over there. It's not me. It's not me. Okay, try again. At any rate, I know from lots of years of going to conferences, this is sort of the sleepy time of a conference. So I'm happy to go with the energy and what y'all are interested in doing for this session. My name is Laura Lengnick, and I have been thinking about working with farmers and doing research and education around adapting to climate change for about 15 years now. You having trouble hearing me? Is it not? Okay. Okay.
Hi, Mr. Milk. How are you?
You're busy. Yeah. That's what you do here, yeah. Yeah, doing well. You, other than all of this, are you good? Personally, yeah. Good. All right.
Everybody, let's take a deep breath in, deep breath out. So I'm Laura Lengnick, and I have spent about the last 15 years or so thinking about adapting agriculture to climate change. I've worked with farmers, I've worked as a researcher, I've been a farmer myself, and also done a lot of education and sort of development of tools that farmers can use, practical planning tools that farmers can use to help them comprehend what's going on with weather and come up with ways to be successful as a farmer, even in what by any measure is a very unprecedented time in farming. I'll talk about this a little more, but I like to open this kind of a presentation by first of all reminding us all that no farmer ever, certainly no farmers in the last 100 years, 150 years, have had to deal with this kind of disruption, with this kind of changing in weather patterns. Although you often hear, particularly in the agriculture community, well, we've dealt with weather forever. Weather is something farmers have always had to deal with. What is happening in certainly the last 20 years anyway, is not your grandfather's weather. It is a really different animal. And so farmers today are going to need new tools and new ways of thinking about managing the risks associated with weather. And I think probably by now we all also understand that even if you don't have some sort of a extreme weather event in your own place where you are, that weather events are also interfering with, for example, supply chains, your ability to get the materials you need in the time that you need them in order to be a successful farmer, and so on. So those ripple effects of climate changing weather patterns are happening and affecting farmers in many different ways. So I like to share that because this idea that farmers today are farming in a new environment and one that previous farmers have not had to manage, because I want to say, give yourself a break. What's going on today in farming around weather, not to mention all the other pressures on successful farming, is very unusual. It's never before been experienced by farmers. And then if you're like me, I love to sit down over my favorite beverage and talk with other folks and kind of get a little bit deeper and talk about deeper things. And it's true what I just said, this is not your grandfather's weather. But if you look at the history of agriculture, as long as there have been farmers on this earth, they've never had to deal with this kind of weather. So we're in a new era for farming, and what I'd like to share with you today is one way that you can think about managing risk on your farm that it is proven to increase the resilience of your farm to more variable weather. And also, although I'm going to speak about weather today, what I think you can see, and I'll point it out where I can see it today, but it also is going to help your farm be more resilient to any kind of disturbance or shock. So that's what I'd like to do today. Does that sound like a good way to spend the next little while? Okay. Great. So I got involved in this business of agricultural resilience maybe about 12 years or so ago. I was the lead author on this USDA report. It was the very first USDA report looking at adaptation options for American farmers. And I was kind of the new kid on the block, and nobody else really wanted to do it. And so they said, who wants to do the adaptation chapter? And I said, oh, okay, I'll do that. Not really knowing that what I was doing was stepping into a whole new phase of my work as a professional scientist, agricultural scientist. But it was fascinating to me to learn about adaptation. It was also sobering for me to learn about what was going on in farm country. Even back then, this was 2011, when we worked on this report. And I think for me, one way to sum up what's going on, what climate change means to farmers, this was the National Farmers Union, came out a couple of years ago and said, okay, we're going to cut through all the detail, all the complexity, all the politics. We're going to cut through it all. Here's what we know about climate change. It's going to get more difficult and expensive to grow food. Climate stressors, so these are weather-related events, will strain relationships between farmers and communities. And so that's kind of the downside. The upside is agricultural landscapes can be a source of climate change solutions. And I really like this very simple list of here's the deal with climate change and farmers, because it gets at the most important bits, I think. It's pretty simple, pretty easy to understand, and gets at the most important bits. So before I get going on sharing with you what I've learned, I've been on a journey now for the last 15 years or so to understand agricultural adaptation, what it means for American farmers, and what we know, what science can tell us about adaptation and resilience, and what farmers can tell us about adaptation and resilience. Just before I get started on sharing a little bit about what I've learned, I want to just let you know who this is standing in front of you. I've worked in soil health for about 30 years. I'm trained as a soil health scientist. As I like to say, I was doing soil health way before it was cool. And, for most of my career, I'd go to a party and somebody would say, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a soil scientist, and there'd be crickets. And then they'd walk away. And I'd say in the last 8 years or so, one of the great satisfactions for me in my work is that now I go to a party, and in the last 8 years or so, I go to the party and I say I'm a soil, and everybody's, oh, can I get you a drink? Tell me, what's going on. And I'm a little bit, the fact that it's satisfying is maybe a side of me that maybe I don't want to share publicly. But the important thing is it's been so gratifying to have the public in general begin to understand that soils are something that's important, and that we can manage them in different ways and help build the health of the soil, the health of the farm, and the health of the community as well. So I've worked as a researcher, as an educator, as a farmer, as an activist, around and about issues of soil health and sustainable agriculture for my whole career. As I said, in the last 12 years or so, I've really leaned into understanding how we can apply resilience science to managing farms and helping farmers adapt to climate change. And the piece I think perhaps might be of most interest to this audience and this folks that are coming to this conference is I do have about 5 years experience doing diversified organic vegetable production, a few years in Virginia, and then 3 years in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where I've lived for the last 20 years. And as a farmer, one of the wake-up calls for me, something that I noticed farming, that really got my attention and actually shifted my professional work into adaptation was in 2011 in Asheville. I was farming with 2 partners. We had this just beautiful, rockin', diversified organic veg operation, beautiful soils. We had a bunch of beds. We were doing everything on 100 square foot beds. And we'd been going for a few years. And one day, we went out to the farm, and we'd had this incredible rain, just a week of incredible rain in the middle of the season. And we went out to this site, the farm beds, and there were springs coming up in all of our vegetable beds. Running water, like almost, it's a little exaggeration, geysers, little tiny geysers coming up. It was unbelievable what was going on. And we asked a couple old timers in the neighborhood, in the area, to come out and take a look, like what's going on, because of course the plants were drowning in all of these beds. And the old timers came out and said they'd never seen anything like that. They had no idea that kind of thing could happen. And so that experience for me as a farmer led me to begin looking at what the heck is going on? What is this climate change? I thought climate change was something in the future. It's not really something that I needed to be concerned about as a farmer right now. So that really had a big impression on me. And I would have to say that as I moved into this climate resilience work, and adaptation work, I brought all the things that I learned as a farmer into that work. And one of the things I learned was you really got to talk to farmers. Science is great. I think there's a lot of value to the information that scientists develop, but I don't think it's particularly helpful until it is, maybe we could say, leavened by practical experience, and particularly when it comes to adaptation, local knowledge. It turns out that climate change is global, but resilience is local. Another way to think of it is climate change is global, but adaptation is local. And so one of the things, so I've told you one thing I want you to remember, if you don't remember anything else, and that is the challenges farmers are facing today with weather, no other farmer has ever faced in the history of agriculture. So keep that in mind. And then the second thing is that because adaptation is local, you are the expert. If you know your land and you know how it responds to different kinds of weather, you are most of the way there to coming up with an effective adaptation plan. And what I want to do today is show you a very simple process for taking what you know already about your land and developing a climate resilience plan. So that's what practical climate resilience is all about. Okay, so just let's remind us all that what we're really talking about here is risk. How do we manage the risk associated with more variable weather and extreme weather events and changes in weather patterns? Weather patterns, established weather patterns. One of the great joys of traveling and meeting farmers in different parts of the country for me is learning these sort of local farming guidelines, farming dates. And I heard one yesterday, and I just love it. And I wonder if others use this. So Derby Day. Derby Day is a thing in Kentucky for farmers. And I'm seeing some nods that you're actually planting around of some crops around Derby Day. And so, you know, all of that's sort of a thing up in, or over maybe in Illinois. There are pasture-based livestock farmers, and what they use to decide when it's okay to put their livestock out for the first time in the spring, they've got to freeze the frogs 3 times. And what they're talking about is peepers, spring peepers, and they basically, once the peepers start singing, they have to have 3 more hard freezes, and then it's safe to put the young livestock out. So that's the kind of local knowledge that I'm describing when I say, you know, it's a very important piece of this climate resilience planning. So we're talking about risk, and I like to remind us all, you know, what is risk really, and to remember that it's this sort of culmination of a probability of an event happening and the consequences of that event. It's kind of this mix of these two things. And what climate change is doing is changing the relationships between, or changing where farms are experiencing risk in this matrix of possibilities. And what it's doing is it's basically driving everything kind of higher and more consequential along the way through this. So it's increasing risk, and this kind of risk, and what I'll be speaking about today, is it's actually called climate risk. And what it is the additional risk that's associated with the changing weather patterns and extremes, if that matters to you. So when we think about typical agricultural risk, it looks something like this. This is very standard. If you look in any kind of farmer's guide to risk management, you're going to see that risk is kind of nice and neatly divvied up into these different areas of farm management: production and financial and marketing and human and legal. And this approach, or this way of looking at risk, it's been useful to us. It's also pretty limited. And when I look at that, what I see that's so limiting is where is the relationship between production and marketing? How do humans come into the production part of this? So it's got limitations because there's no way that this model shows the relationships. And it turns out that resilience is in the relationships, thinking about how things fit together and changing your management, maybe the design of your farm and the management of your farm, to take advantage of the benefits of the relationships. And I'll show you what that means in just a minute. The other thing that I think limits our traditional thinking about adaptation to climate change is typically climate shows up in production risk. Would you say that's true? When you hear about it, where do you hear about it? It's about having to plant too late, or it's too wet to get a crop in, or those sorts of things. And the truth is that climate is actually affecting all of the different traditional silos of risk on a farm. And so looking at this a decade ago, what I thought was we need to find another way to think about risk. And it turns out there's a good one. We need to shift from thinking about this old, outdated risk management model that's served agriculture well, but isn't serving us so well anymore. And we need to shift to a different kind of model of how a farm works. And in that model, which is called a whole farm model, you've still got the risk in there. You see that in the center of that farm circle. But then you've got the farm as a whole. And that farm is nested within a family. And when I talk about family in this context, I'm not talking just about the typical, American nuclear family, but whoever it is that loves that land, that tends that land, that cares about that land going on in the future. So it's a little bit of a looser definition of family. So we have those different types of risk within this farm, which is within a family. And then that family is within a community. And this kind of thinking about managing risk actually allows you to take advantage of the resilience benefits of relationship. So one example I can give right now, although imagine you can think of lots of them, is that when you have a family running a farm, you have a built-in group of supporters, ideally. I know it can be fraught to work with family around a farm, but you've got people that love that place. There's a sense of history and tradition, and so you can work with those that the emotions, with the love of that land, and the history, the knowledge over time of that land, to think about how to enhance the resilience of that farm. In the same way, if we think about that family community, those interactions, we've got community that can support the farm. We've got the farm able to support community. And so again, this new way of thinking about risk is to shift from managing those specific risks, which now show up just at the center of this group of circles, into cultivating resilience of the farm, the family, and the community. So after I learned some of these ideas, I decided I wanted to test them. I wanted to go out and see how, give them some ground truth to these ideas, to see whether farmers around the country were actually using any of these ideas, or just how were they thinking. And I started a project that I never knew would grow to be, it's now 12 years or so old. It has almost 50 farmers involved in it. And I went around, started questioning them in 2011, went around and asked farmers, what kinds of weather, how is the weather changing? How is that challenging you as a farmer? How are you responding? What kinds of adaptations are you making? And are they working? And are they working? And in these conversations emerged this idea of resilience. And I've written about this. You can find lots of things online if you're interested. The second edition of my book, Resilient Agriculture, which basically lays out, it's got lessons about farm resilience, how farmers can use resilience principles in their management, and then lots of stories of farmers that have. These farmers, broad group of farmers, range in scale from 1 acre to 5,000 acres. They call themselves, particularly now, when I started, many of them were really comfortable with sustainable farmers. They said they were sustainable farmers, but now they're organic, they're regenerative, they're climate smart, and they've all got different names, but they have different labels for what it is they're doing now. But what holds them together as a group is they all are managing ecosystems. They're managing for healthy ecosystems on the farm, no matter what it is they call themselves. And so I thought I'd give you the good stuff. A lot of farmers, they just want to hear the good stuff. Like, this is it. So here's the result of 12 years of research, talking with farmers, having conversations. I also check back in with them about every 4 to 5 years and ask them how it's going. And you can read more about those farmers and a lot of the stories. It's free download at realworldresilience.com if you want to go meet some of those farmers and read some of their stories. But here's the top risk management strategies that this particular group of farmers use. Probably I should say too, that this group of farmers, all of them have been recognized either regionally or nationally as being really good farmers. And that was important to me too. I also thought it would be really interesting to talk with farmers that essentially, that first of all, we're using that we're managing ecosystems, because ecosystems are already shifting because of climate change. So these farmers really were at the front lines of climate change in a real way. And then the other thing about this group of farmers, these sustainable farmers back 12 years ago, is that many of them were farming without a safety net. They're not eligible for typical subsidized insurance programs, for example. And so again, really on the front lines of managing climate risk and having to do it through thinking carefully about adjusting the ecosystem under their care. They're not just adding they're not free to just add fertilizer or add a pesticide. It was really a much more complex effort for them to continue to be successful. Okay, so the top risk management strategies, soil health, number one. No surprise, we're hearing about that, and a lot of reasons why soil health is in particular a really useful characteristic to promote on your farm, particularly because one important aspect of climate change is that everyone's seeing it, and I know already from being here yesterday, you're seeing it here too, too much and not enough water and all in the same year. It's like, how do you figure that out, right? So soil health is it's number one way to figure that out, right? Soil acts like a sponge, And a sponge soaks up water and also maintains some air within the soil body as well. The second is some kind of planned biodiversity. And I know these are not going to be new to a group of organic farmers, but planned biodiversity. These farmers have really leaned into taking care with biodiversity and also thinking about biodiversity on their whole farm landscape, not just within a field or within a crop rotation, but really beginning to do things like adding windbreaks that are made up of species they can also harvest, for example, or restoring riparian areas, the areas alongside streams, so that they can buffer the heavy rains and the flooding, things like that. So planned biodiversity, really an important piece as well. A third thing that I think I hear less often is to be diverse also in your markets, but always go for they market in different channels, but they always go for the highest value market within a channel. Does that make sense? Ideally, I mean, that's what you're trying to do. But I think we've seen COVID has certainly taught us this, and other kind of major events in the disruptions in the last 5 years or so. It's pretty dangerous to market in one market, because if that market is disturbed or shocked in some way, what are you doing? So these farmers have really worked on developing diverse, high-value markets. Improved water management, also related to that, too much and not enough. But farmers are really going above and beyond. This group of farmers are doing things now like doing major land management, changing the landscape, the shape of the landscape, building in berms and swales, and adding perennials to the landscape, doing agroforestry practices that are combined with land surface water management structures. So really starting to lean more into that, building a lot more ponds, and sometimes retreating from areas of their farm that are repeatedly damaged by something like flooding. So those kinds of things are happening. Physical protection, another very important management strategy. I'm seeing, and that's just somehow there's a structure that is protecting cropland or land that you're growing on from protecting it from heavy rain, basically. And so I've seen everything from what is very typical in organic farming, some kind of a hoop house or a greenhouse, and adding more of that kind of protection and growing always in a controlled environment. But I'm also seeing, I've seen farmers who are beginning to prepare land whenever the soil conditions are right for that, and then covering with tarps. They're not tarping for occultation, they're tarping just to keep the land dry and ready for when they need to plant the next succession. So lots of really creative ways to use physical protection out there as well. And then finally, recovery reserves. So one important theme that I've found in talking with these groups of farmers is that they have got some kind of savings or some kind of social banking that they're doing, so that when there is a disruption to their farming system, they have the resources necessary to be able to recover swiftly. Another thing that they're doing is designing and managing their farms so that they, when there is damage, it's less damage than there might have been. And so it's less expensive, and they can recover in a shorter amount of time. So there's also that aspect. And then the last thing I'll share with you is that what I also noticed talking with this group of farmers, and I think if you go in and read some of these stories, this is very clear, They're using all of these practices. It turns out that resilient farmers are not just focusing on soil health or just focusing on recovery reserves. They're using this whole suite of practices, and that's what it takes in order to remain successful as weather patterns change. The last thing I'll say, I forgot to say this, is please ask questions. I realize I'm kind of rolling now, but if you have a question or you really don't understand something. Okay, so what I'd like to do with the rest of the time here is give you a little bit of the framework or structure for thinking, this new way of thinking about, to help you move from managing risk to cultivating resilience. And this is a lot, I know it's a lot. I'm just gonna talk about 3 chunks of it, but really I also want you to know that you can go online, it's a free PDF download, Cultivating Climate Resilience. On farms and ranches. It's a free download from SARE. It's an excellent overview of everything I'm going to say from here out, okay? What I want to just show you is that when we're thinking about climate risk, if you look at that top left-hand side of that, so when we're thinking about climate risk, there's kind of 3 things to think about. And the first is to recognize that there's this interaction occurring on your farm, and it's occurring on your farm like no other place. That's that local nature of adaptation. But there's several things interacting, and the first is an exposure, and that's just what kind of weather shows up on your farm. The second is the sensitivity of the farm, so the crops and the livestock of the farm, how are they responding to that weather? How sensitive or insensitive are they as individuals to whatever that weather event is? And the last bit, that adaptive capacity, that's the really interesting piece, because now we're thinking about the farm as a whole. And what adaptive capacity is describing is the ability of the farm as a whole, the relationships that you create and manage on the farm as a whole, for those relationships to respond to disturbance and shock in ways that protect the system. Also, an adaptive capacity, that's resilience. That's resilience, which is the second piece of this diagram. And resilience is a whole lot more than bouncing back. So that'd be the third thing I want you to remember when you leave here, if you don't remember anything else. You know, resilience is actually 3 complementary capacities of a system. And you can actually design and manage for all 3 of these capacities. And so that recovery capacity, that's the one we all think, many people think about, is kind of what it is, resilience is. It's that ability to bounce back. But it turns out there are 2 other capacities that I think are way more valuable to farmers. And the first one is called response capacity, and that's the ability to design and manage a system so that it avoids damage when there is disturbance. And the other capacity is transformation capacity, and that's the ability to look ahead and begin to prepare now for changes that you know are coming. And I like to think about that capacity as the bounce forward. Now, the bounce back, recovery, that's important too, because we can't be sure that we're managing a farm, we've designed to manage a farm so that it can respond to any kind of disturbance, right? There may be a weather pattern coming down the road that it's going to cause damage to your farm. So you need also to be thinking about recovery capacity. And remember I said that one thing I noticed about that national group of farmers I've been speaking with, they use all of them. They use all those practices, soil health and water management and recovery reserves and marketing and all of that. What you will find if you spend a little bit of time with this bulletin, this SARE bulletin, is that those practices as a group are cultivating response, recovery, and transformation. So these farmers are doing this all the time, thinking about how to cultivate these three complementary capacities of resilience. Okay, and then the last bit is what I'm imagining y'all probably came for, which is, okay, what's the toolbox? What are the practices we can use? And this bulletin goes through those practices as well. I've already shared with you those kind of key practices that I found in that group of farmers. But one thing I want to point out to you that is another thing that the farmers I've worked with have taught me is that it takes looking broadly at the resources under management. It's not enough to think about soil health, which would fit under that natural resource, in that natural resource part of the toolbox. It's not enough to think about getting some insurance or having some savings, which would be part of that financial resources. They are being very careful to look at all the resources in their toolbox and think about how they can deploy those resources, change a practice to cultivate these beneficial relationships across the whole farm. And then the practice or the part of the toolbox that helps them do this kind of bigger picture thinking about relationships, is that first bullet, whole farm planning. And whole farm planning has actually been around a long time. We know a lot about it, and there's a lot of good evidence that using whole farm planning cultivates resilience of the farm business. So it's as I say, it's not something new, it's something that's been around, but we haven't used it a whole lot. But now there's a real reason to reuse it, because whole farm planning can help you cultivate adaptive capacity, which is going to cultivate resilience to disturbances and shocks. Okay, so I just want to finish up with with a little bit of an overview of a new tool that I have been working on developing, and we just finished it this month, actually. It's just been released. And it's called 5 Steps to Your Regenerative Climate Resilience Plan. And it is a workbook for farmers. And it's been designed as a DIY kind of a workbook. And you can find the workbook. It's a free download from regenerativefarmresilienceguide.org if you want to take a look at it. But I just want to walk you through, pretty quickly, through the steps of this planning process. So step 1 is to take a step back from your worries about changing weather patterns and how that's affecting your farm, and revisit farm goals. Update your farm goals, and also get a snapshot of your current farm position. And the way you can do this, there are 2 resilience planning tools. Both of them have been around for a long time, and we know they work. It just turns out that they also support resilience thinking by farm managers. And the first one, to get that snapshot of a current business position, it's a very well-known tool. In fact, lots of people roll their eyes when I say it, the SWOT. The strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, kind of a snapshot of your farm. But it turns out this is pretty important to help you begin to create a picture of your whole farm. Just very simply, a SWOT helps you just lay out some ideas and characteristics of your farm, both internal to your farm and external, that are affecting your business position. And that the strengths and weaknesses are internal, and the opportunities and threats are external. Any place you go on the web, you can find some directions for how to do that, but you also can, the directions are in the guide. Also, within that guide, I forgot to say, so that you can go to that Regenerative Farm Resilience Guide website, and there's also a group of 50 resources that you can search that can help you to complete the 5 steps in the guide. So that's also there at the website. Okay, and the second tool is a holistic management tool, and it's called the 3-part holistic goal. And this kind of goal setting is particularly useful for encouraging whole farm thinking and resilience thinking, because it includes aspects of the farm goals that you don't typically see in other kinds of farm goal setting. And one of those important aspects is quality of life. And if you remember that sort of concentric circles, that nest of circles, farm, family, community, the quality of life part of the holistic goal is addressing very directly family. How do you desire? What do you desire in your life? How do you desire to live? And then there's this commitment section, which is just basically describing what you need to do and to be in order to support that quality of life. And the last part, the future resource base, also sometimes called future vision, is putting yourself 20 years into the future, walking around your farm, and describing what you see if you achieve your quality of life that you desire. It's a lot in a short presentation. You can go to the website and you can find some good resources to help you think about that. But it's very different from a typical farm business goal kind of approach. And again, it's encouraging a farmer to think about this bigger picture of farm, family, community. And just a little bit more about HM. Just want to let you know that there are 2 organizations in the U.S. that promote holistic management practices. And the first is Savory Institute, and many people have heard of the Savory Institute. They specifically focus on working with pasture-based livestock producers. But there's another group, it's called Holistic Management International, and they work with a much broader group of farmers. So if you're not a pasture-based producer, but maybe even if you are, I'd encourage you to go check out HMI as well. And then the other thing I wanted to show you, so this diagram gives you the whole, it's a snapshot of holistic management. All the different practices and the principles. It's a great shorthand for what's involved in holistic management. And what I want you to notice is, if you look at holistic goal, it's the 3rd line down. It's a brown 3rd line. You see that holistic goal, quality of life, behaviors and systems. They use a little bit different terminology, but that's the commitments, and then the future, right? The vision for the future. So what we're doing in the 5 steps process is just taking one holistic practice out and making use of it. But there are also other practices in HM that really can help to cultivate resilience of your farm. Okay, the second step, figuring out what your climate risk is on your farm. Some pretty typical climate risks. Farmers all across the country are reporting water, too much and not enough, more variable temperature and rainfall, warmer winters, warmer nights. Usually when I go down this list, I see nodding heads, more frequent and intense heat waves, more pest and disease pressures, and more disruption of pollination and fruiting. So the guide will step you through really thinking through all the possible climate change effects climate risk that you're experiencing on your farm. And that's the second step. Now that gives you a smaller set of risk. Typically, it's a smaller set of risks that you would then focus on in your planning. Step 3 is what adaptation strategies What will be your strategy for managing the climate risks that show up on your farm? And I just want to, I don't want to go into it today, but just understand remember we have these 3 different complementary capacities of resilience: response, recovery, transformation, and there are groups of practices within each of these strategies that you can choose from. And the guide has a menu of practices that you can choose from. And that can help you make sure that as you're making your climate resilience plan, you're cultivating all 3 capacities in some way. All right, remember that was an important piece of what the farmers taught me. You have to be cultivating all 3 of these capacities. And the 4th step, best fit practices. So now this gets down into more traditional planning. Once you have chosen the practices that you think will work for your farm, then you have to pencil to paper, pencil out, is it feasible given your current rotations or your farming system, and what are the cost benefits of different kinds of practices within a particular strategy. So that is more traditional business planning. And then once you have chosen those individual practices, you then go back and take another look, kind of review everything one more time. You make sure that you're hitting all 3, that your plan as a whole is contributing to all 3 complementary capacities: response, recovery, transformation. You want to make sure that you're using a pretty diverse group of tools in your toolbox, not just focusing on, for example, financial tools or natural resource tools. And then the last step is to then also take a step back and say, and is this helping me make progress to my holistic goal? Or one way to think about this is this helping me make progress towards my business goals and my family goals? And then the last step is to write out your climate resilience plan, and that involves writing out the resilience strategies that you're using, specific practices within those strategies, figuring out implementation steps and a timeline, and then also a monitoring plan. And this monitoring plan is particularly important. It's the part that always gets left out when you're doing whole farm planning. But because of the nature of climate risk and the uncertainties associated with climate risk, really important that you once you've decided on some practices and implemented them, you really want to go back and say, did it work? How well did it work? And then decide at that point, do I need to change or adjust or tweak? Or do I need to forget that practice because it didn't work? So this period of evaluating how well the practices that you've chosen, which is really evaluating the response of your farm to the weather-related challenges, is a very important piece to cultivating resilience. And so then I just want to leave you with some resources that can help you get started. All of these resources are on the available at the Regenerative Farm Resilience Guide website, and you see the URL is right down there at the bottom. So these resources are either helping you think about climate risk or managing agricultural risk, doing some whole farm planning. I've shown you some of the SARE bulletin. I've talked about the 5 steps guide, and also a little bit about my book. And if you're interested to read some of these stories, many of the stories that I've collected over the last decade or so are available at realworldresilience.com as a free download. So that's what I've got for you today. We've got just a few minutes if there's any questions anybody has. Yes?
How did you select your farmers or recruit your farmers for your study?
How did I select them or recruit them? Yeah, I remember I was doing this like 14 years ago. And when I I recruited them by looking, first of all, for award-winning, sustainable farmers. I was trying to get a little bit of a broad net in that. And I made a 400 inquiries, and most of the responses from farmers were, "We're so glad you're doing this. We're not going to talk about this publicly." It was a different world then in climate change. So these farmers that, particularly the group, because I added a second group, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, but particularly that first group, I really admired their courage because it was tough. And if you go to Real World Resilience, look at some of those first farmers. I mean, they were in very conservative parts of the world, and that they were willing first to trust me, but then also to go on record as saying that the weather was changing and that it was challenging them. Back then was really tough. So I talked with extension agents, with nonprofit groups like Oak, and just put out all my network, every kind of network I had based on at that time it was 20 years of working in sustainable ag, to just try to find farmers that were willing. And then once I found that they were willing, I tried to get a diversity of farms. I was really interested in getting small and mid and large scale, just all the things, different regions of the country, all the things that, all the factors that we knew at that time were influencing the resilience of farming systems. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And so how do you, when there's so many different changes happening and sometimes they flip, maybe you've got one wet year and one dry year, how do you navigate that? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. And so I think part of that, part of what the guide will help you do is, first of all, map all the important weather challenges on your farm. And then it will help you decide which ones you want to focus on. And there's some guidance on how to do that. But also, I think taking a little bit of a longer view is going to be important. I mean, you don't want to base your climate resilience plan on last year. At least maybe 5 years. Take a look at, over the last 5 years, where have the challenges emerged around weather patterns. And if you are a new farmer, I would say talk to your neighbors. Just talk to farmers that have experience, because they're going to be able to help you hone in on which risks really are important ones for you. The other thing I want to say to new farmers is that the one thing you have going for you that the more experienced farmers don't is you don't expect anything to be the same from year to year. And I don't know if you've noticed this, if you've read any interviews or talked to farmers or gone to another session where there are farmers talking about climate risk and how climate change is affecting them. But never fails, when a more experienced farmers ask that question, they always at some point refer to, well, back when I was, this is what it was. And actually, I opened with these ideas like Derby Day and, freeze the frogs 3 times. And I almost think that it's a little bit of a limitation to be farming and even having that memory that it used to be stable. Because it did used to be stable, right? So hopefully, if that helps any, just give yourself a break. And maybe that's a way that young farmers or less experienced farmers, actually it's a benefit to just know that from year to year things are going to really change. Yeah.